Hello and welcome to a video about Paleoconservatism and its implications throughout history and the modern times. Ironic, isn't it? Because it is paleo meaning in the Greek sense ancient or old. So old conservatism, what could that mean? When you look at the definition of paleoconservative in Conservapedia, it says that it is an ideology that supports strong restrictions on immigration, a rollback on multicultural programs, the decentralization of federal policy, the restoration of controls upon free trade, a greater control or emphasis on economic nationalism and isolationism in the conduct of American foreign policy, and wants to recover the old social lines of distinction, in particular the assignments of roles according to gender, ethnicity, and race. So that's how they differ from mainstream conservatives, in that they are not free trade, they are pro fair trade. They are immigration restrictionist, which is antithetical to the Republican orthodoxy of the last couple decades. And they are more enforcing of social norms. For example, if you were to look at the campaign platforms of John McCain and Mitt Romney, they were still against gay marriage, whereas Trump was ambivalent to it. So what you see is that, progressively speaking, people get less conservative over time, at least in the Republican orthodoxy, which is why old conservatives, aka paleoconservatives, are wanting to go back to the times of when the gays were still shut out from society and not promoted. Okay? So these people are anti-communist, of course, but unlike most conservatives today, paleocons are against the Iraq War. They were critical of the Bush administration, full of neoconservatives. I made a video about neoconservatives. They are people that are pro-war, pro-democracy through force in other regions and intervening in preemptive war, where people that are prominent in this society, in this movement, which is Pat Buchanan and Nick Fuentes, for example. So in regard to the government, the Paleocons strongly oppose American membership in the United Nations. They also want to seek limiting the power of the federal government in a lot of ways and strongly support states' rights. Paleos believe that America was founded on a constitutional republic basis and support that instead of direct democracy. They also have a critical view of Abraham Lincoln and a view that the Confederacy was on the right side of the war sometimes. So this goes more into like the white nationalism type of strain. Culture-wise, paleocons are different from neocons in immigration and affirmative action, even more so than a person like Ben Shapiro does. And this goes into the culture thing. They want to support a European culture. They want people to assimilate, and they don't want people coming in fact. As a result of all this, paleocons are most extensive in their empathetic opposition to the open immigration by non-Europeans and their general disapproval of U.S. intervention overseas for the purposes of exporting democracy. Paleocons are conservative Christians like Protestant, fundamentalist, and trad Catholics. They oppose religious pluralism and support the orthodoxy and doctrine being enforced in America. Economically, specifically, paleocons support the free market capitalist state but want restrictions. For example, they are against free trade. They support tariffs. They do strongly oppose socialism and communism. They want to replace the Federal Reserve with the constitutional monetary system, but this is more of a nuanced argument within the paleoconservative movement. People like Nick Fuentes don't seem to be against the Federal Reserve. I'm not against the Federal Reserve, right? They are deeply concerned with the United States loans of large amounts to the World Bank and from it, and they don't like the trade deficit that we're running. But unlike mainstream conservatives, they don't like supporting Israel. Israel takes about $3.8 billion a year from America in terms of foreign aid. But more specifically, and Nick Fuentes mentioned this point, it is that they take 3.8 billion years in loans, which are converted to grants, as in we give them a loan and forgive the loan, and they can even make interest on the loan. So it's very interesting. We made a contract under Barack Obama, I believe, to give them 3.8 billion a year times 10 years is 38, inflation of course. So we were spending about $40 billion on Israel over 10 years. What do they give us? Now that is arguable, and that is the question that people like the Paleocons like to mention. Anyways, if we were to look at the debt, the Paleoconservatives have a really good reason as to why they are going to mention this. The U.S. national debt is at $24.949 trillion, about $25 trillion. It was about $23.8 trillion before the epidemic came out. Ever since there was grand sickness in 2020, but if we were to look now, 1960, 52% debt to GDP ratio. We go back to the beginning of Ronald Reagan, 34% debt to GDP ratio. You go to the end of Bill Clinton, 58% debt to GDP ratio. Now we are at 116% debt to GDP ratio. So our debt is climbing, not only nominally, but also in relation to how much we are making annually. Our GDP is about 21 trillion, but it is going down. Federal revenues are going down. Payroll taxes going down, mainly because of this epidemic. But overall, we are still paying a ton of money for the debt. $300 billion a year to the debt. We have a trade balance that is not getting that much better, but it is getting better. The trade deficit with China, which used to be, let's say, about $600 billion, is now $325 billion. The trade deficit overall is decreasing to about $832 billion instead of over $1 trillion, I believe. Imported oil as a proportion of GDP is going down. Okay, so we're seeing an economic shift, which is very important to realize under a certain, ostensibly a capitalist system, but with its own kinks that people do not like in the paleoconservative movement. Okay, so we're going to cover some societies within it. When we look at the John Birch Society, they are very popular. If you were to read of Richard Nixon in California, they had a big influence on people like Ronald Reagan and the Pete Wilson, other people around there that were conservatives and not as far right, but they were an antagonistic force in primaries and other places. So while they did not have power directly, somewhat, they did have power in other ways. For example, you'd have people like Larry McDonald, a conservative Democrat from Georgia, people that were, the John Birch Society, a paleoconservative organization which is against wealth redistribution, and they're very anti-communist, but they mainly derive on the thing that they go against the conservative orthodoxy. The John Birch Society is very important. Paleoconservatives are a strong faction in the Republican Party. Remember, they are like the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, but the opposite, okay? So while they don't have direct power, they are influencing the overall narrative. So there was an Eisenhower issue in the 1950s and 60s. He was not far right enough, so he would get primaried or he would get under the threat of it. That made him change the way he governed. We go on to the 70s. They are still going against they're trying to impeach Justice Earl Warren, who was a moderate. So this is the thing. They are very pro-American and they're very libertarian-esque. Paleoconservatives are commonly mistaken with paleo-libertarians, but let me get this clear. Paleoconservatives are more strong on social issues and they want to use the government more so. People like Nick Fuentes are proud to say that they are status enforcing anti-homosexual policy, anti-abortion, and other things like that. From 2009 to now, the John Birch Society has been more linked to Donald Trump in terms of being more nativist. They support Rand Paul, for example, so that's their libertarian side. Congressman Thomas Massey, for example, another strong person and personality for that. And you see, they are critical of a lot of things. Now, the paleoconservatives are for fair trade, so they were against NAFTA. They were against the USMCA even. And they like to see things in a big picture sense. So that's very important to note. There's the Edmund Burke Society, but who cares about that? That is a right-wing populist movement in Canada, which is irrelevant. So let's go to the next point. And we have our biggest figure overall in paleoconservatism, you could argue, which is Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan, born in 1938, so he's about 81 right now. He's going to die soon, but let's cover him. He is an Irish Catholic. Pat Buchanan was from Virginia. He was a St. Louis Globe Democrat editorial writer, so he was an irrelevant writer at some point. He worked for Nixon. Now, this is very important. So, in his early 30s, he was working for Nixon already. He's very important to popularize certain things. See, this is where paleoconservative, where I was mentioning, paleoconservatives can jump into jobs that are low-key. They sneak in, like how they criticize the Jews. They subvert a movement, and they come in and they get their influence through. As a White House assistant and speechwriter, Nixon was influenced by Buchanan by, for example, coining the phrase of silent majority, which helped shape the strategy that drew millions of Democrats to switch to Nixon, for example, and that helped beat McGovern very soundly. Buchanan remained a special assistant to Nixon even through the last days of the Watergate scandal, where he got away scot-free. He basically was able to avoid all troubles there, which let him be very elusive. But this got him to be hated by the conservatives. For example, Associate Director of the FBI, Mark Felt, called Buchanan a sneaky and dishonest criminal because of his role in Nixon campaign attack groups. So Buchanan was hated by certain people, but he survived that era in the 70s. Buchanan briefly stayed as a special assistant under Gerald Ford and Chief of Staff Alexander Haig, and he wanted to become an ambassador, or he was offered the ambassadorship of South Africa. But I think President Ford did not want him to do that. So this goes to show he can get higher offices. Paleoconservatives can get higher offices, but the optics of it seems to be bad. Long after resignation, Nixon even called Buchanan a confidant and said that he was neither a racist nor an anti-Semite, neither a bigot nor a hater, but a decent, patriotic American. Nixon then said that Buchanan had some strong views, such as isolationist foreign policy, which they disagreed with each other in. And Nixon didn't think that Buchanan should become a president, but that he should be heard. This is very, very interesting because while Nixon was a globalist, Buchanan was able to thread the needle, and he was able to stay in a globalist administration and move it more to the right wing. This is very interesting. He was critical in keeping Nixon on the Republican right side of history. Very, very noteworthy, because when you look at the Nixon administration and even the Ford administration in the 1970s and even 60s before that, Henry Kissinger, this Jewish Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to both Nixon and Ford, was critical in having globalist operations, which led to the deaths of millions of Pakis and Bangladeshi people, I believe. But not only that, but he was pivotal to opening up Red China, which Buchanan would later become to hate. But notice how paleoconservatives are treated. While Nixon respects a guy like Buchanan, he is not ingratiated exactly within the administration to become an ambassador, which he had the full capacity to become, nor would he be endorsed to become president by Nixon himself, even though Nixon was alive by the time that Buchanan ran in 1992. So this is very noteworthy, okay, guys? Keep that in mind. So paleoconservatives seemingly are to the as far right as you can possibly get without being called a racist by other people, or an anti-Semite or a bigot, but you are not close enough to the center to become ingratiated with the American people, it would seem. Okay, now, he was a news commentator from 1978 to 1984. He was part of the McLaughlin Group, Crossfire. Crossfire is very important for politics, so that kept him relevant for over half a decade, and then he started working as Ronald Reagan's White House Communications Director from 85 to 87. He was not too important in that administration as he was for Nixon, as Nixon was more of a desperate guy and more paranoid, so he trusted Buchanan more, proportionately speaking. So Buchanan was thinking about running in 1988, and he said that the conservative movement needed a leader, but Buchanan didn't feel strongly about this, and he sat out the 1988 race so that Jack Kemp could take up the mantle. Okay, now with the Central Park 5 incident, so this is an important view on how a paleoconservative goes about minorities. Buchanan called for the lynching in 1989 of the 16-year-old black teenager and for the horsewhipping of these other 4 brown people. for having allegedly raped a white jogger in the Central Park 5 incident in New York. He called for the civilization of barbarians by putting the fear of death into those barbarians. So, again, that's a very, very strong racial statement. And, things like these are unoptical for the movement. Okay? And, while not all the time is he a racist, no, but he is seen as one. Now, there's accusations of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial in his record. Buchanan wrote that it was impossible for 850,000 Jews to be killed by a diesel exhaust fed into the gas chamber at Treblinka in the 1990 column for the New York Post, and he argued that Treblinka was not a death camp but a transit camp used as a pass-through point for prisoners. But some others say that 900,000 Jews died at Treblinka, and so Republican George Will, challenged him, and this is very interesting because people like paleoconservatives are racially aware, and they will go against the common story about the Holocaust, and they get very burnt for it. So, yet again, another career move by a paleocon that is very dumb, because not only could he literally prove that not that many Jews died, but what do you get out of proving that not that many Jews died? He got slandered for it. And a 40,000-word article by William F. Buckley Jr. was published by the National Review discussing anti-Semitism among conservative commentators, which was almost solely based on Buchanan. And that article was basically saying that he concluded, I quote, "I find it impossible to defend Pat Buchanan against the charge that what he did and said during the period under examination amounted to anti-Semitism." So basically, William F. Buckley Jr., a conservative hegemon at the time, a leader of the mainstream Republicans in the 80s, for example, completely threw Pat Buchanan under the bus. Very important for the conservative movement in the late 20th century. The Anti-Defamation League, which is a Jewish-run organization largely, called Buchanan an unrepentant bigot who repeatedly demonizes Jews and minorities and openly affiliates with white supremacists. So, again, a lot of bad optics. But as a member of the Reagan White House, he is accused of having been suppressed the Reagan Justice Department's investigation into Nazi scientists. And in the context of the Gulf War, in September 15th, 1990, Buchanan was in the McLaughlin Group, and he said that there are only two groups that are beating the drums of war in the Middle East, and that is the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States. So, he is very cool at looking at this. He is very extremist, it would seem, at the mainstream. So, yet again, another example of paleocons being at the very outer scraping edge of what is in the Overton window. Another quote from Buchanan says that Capitol Hill is an Israeli-occupied territory, and if you want to know the ethnicity and power in the United States Senate, 13 members of the Senate are Jewish folks, who are among them 2% of the population, and that's where the real power is at. While all of that is true, that is bad optics. Like I said, Buchanan wanted to support the President Reagan's plan to visit a German military cemetery at Bitburg in 1985, where among the dead Wehrmacht soldiers, there was 48 Waffen-SS members at the assistance of the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and over the vocal objections of Jews. The trip went through. In an interview with author Elie Wiesel, he said that the only one really defending the trip was Pat Buchanan, saying that we can now get the perception that the president was being subjected to the Jewish pressure. And Buchanan accused Wiesel of fabricating a story, saying that basically this is the whole summary of this story. It is that Elie Wiesel's a liar. There's websites about this guy, Elie Wiesel, particular, one of these Holocaust grifters. Okay? But Pat Buchanan going against him publicly burnt him again. Shows you who runs the media, doesn't it? Okay, in 1990, he published a newsletter saying that he wanted to primary Bush, So in 1992, he had a quote that was very strong. He said, if the country wants to go in a liberal direction, if the country wants to go in the direction of Georgia Mitchell and Tom Foley, it doesn't bother me as long as I have made it the best case I can. What I can't stand are the backroom deals. They're all in on it. The exciter game, the establishment game. This is what we are running against. Notice the appeals to the, dog whistling to the American people. So he's saying, he's riling them up. He's saying, we need to stand against these Democrats and these sellout liberal Republicans like Bush and these backroom deals. So a right-wing populist upsurgence in 1992 is what Buchanan ran on. At this point, he was 54 years old, for context. He ran on the platform of immigration reduction, social conservatism, opposition to multiculturalism, abortion, and gay rights. Buchanan challenged Bush, whose party popularity was waning. He even won about 2/5 of the vote in the New Hampshire primary. So you got 3 million votes, or 23% of the total vote in 1992. Buchanan later threw support behind Bush, ultimately in the 1992 Republican National Convention, which was the Culture War speech, in which he described a religious war going on in the country, in the soul of America. In the speech, he said that Bill and Hillary Clinton, quote, the agenda of Clinton would oppose on America abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right, but it's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants, and it is not the kind of change that we can abide in a nation where we can still call God's country. Very interesting, right? Notice what he said in this. He claimed Clinton wanted all these liberal things, which was true, but then he said this is not the change that America wants. But when you look at the election of 1992 and 1996, it is clear that the country and America did want these changes. They did vote for those changes, at least. So, right-wing populist movement under Pat Buchanan, but Pat Buchanan can't get the popular support, the populist support to win an election, not even a primary against a weak candidate like George H.W. Bush. What is that to say? Bernie Sanders supporters say they have the people's support. That people support, Medicare for all this thing, free college, but yet they cannot win half of the vote. Pat Buchanan says the people want this, they want this. He can't even get 40% of the vote against George H.W. Bush. So who has the people's vote again? Is it the moderates? Unfortunately, maybe that is the case. Look at the numbers. Okay, so very important. Note that, please. Now, off the campaign trail, he again returned to Rush Limbaugh's show, for example. He would, of course, write articles. So this is what this guy does. Outside of politics, he just writes articles. He does radio shows. He ran in 1996. Okay, note this. Buchanan made another attempt to win the Republican nomination in 1996. He was clearly going to go against the front-runner, who was Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, who was a very, just a very old white guy, very boring. Buchanan sought the Republican nomination to Dole's right, voicing his opposition to NAFTA. Other candidates included Phil Gramm of Texas, Tennessee Governor Lamar Alexander, and cash cow Steve Forbes of Forbes magazine. Notice this. Okay, now Buchanan defeated Dole by about 3,000 votes to win New Hampshire. He also got endorsed by Phyllis Schlafly and other people that aren't so relevant. He finished only slightly behind Dole in Iowa. His insurgent campaign was mostly grassroots, as Buchanan was a broke guy. He ran against the bland establishment, which is clear, as he was quoted by saying that we shocked them in Alaska, stunned them in Louisiana, stunned them in Iowa. They're in a terminal panic. They hear the shouts of the peasants from over the hill. All the knights and barons will be riding in the castle, pulling up the drawbridge in a minute. All the peasants are coming with pitchforks. We are going to take this over the top. Notice this, another populist appeal by a Paleoconservative. Does he win? Of course not. In the Super Tuesday primaries, Dole defeated Buchanan in larger margins, having collected only 21% of the total votes in the Republican primary. Buchanan suspended his campaign in March, and he declared that if Dole were to choose a pro-choice running mate, that he would run on the Constitution Party candidacy. Dole chose Jack Kemp, and he received Buchanan's endorsement after the 1996 campaign. Buchanan returned to Crossfire and worked on his book called The Great Betrayal in 1998. So notice this. Pat Buchanan steps out of the 1988 race to let a more moderate guy like Jack Kemp, a supply-side economist Republican, more libertarian type, run for president in 1998. In that primary, he gets beat by George H.W. Bush, who Buchanan hates, and has the VP pick be the guy who he let run in 1988 and who lost anyway. So Pat Buchanan in these 8 years completely lost everything. He lost the opportunity in 1988. He got his ass kicked in 1992. He got beat again in 1996 and got Jack Kemp to be the VP, not him, not Buchanan. Very interesting, right? He runs again in the year 2000. You got to think, God, what is he, the perennial loser now? What, the third time he's running? Well, Buchanan announced his departure from the Republican Party in October 1999. And this is really important because he was inspired by Ross Perot, who did not even endorse him in any way. But anyway, let's look at this. He ran for the Reform Party. He ran, very noteworthy. He ran against Donald Trump. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, he is seen to have spoiled the vote in terms of Florida for Al Gore. So if you were to look at it, you see that in the 2000 presidential election, Pat Buchanan had 0.4% of the popular vote, and he received 3,400 votes in Florida, apparently, in Palm Beach County's liberal area full of Jews, showing that they would never vote for him. But with the butterfly ballot being what it was, that ballot was hard to calculate or punch in the hole to vote. He's suspected of gaining thousands of votes that were accidental, that were supposed to go to Al Gore, but showed to be a Pat Buchanan type of stronghold, which is weird, right? So apparently he spoiled the election inadvertently for Al Gore, so I don't know if he wanted a globalist neoconservative as president in 2000 or if he wanted a neoliberal right-winger like Al Gore to become president. Very interesting. If maybe Pat Buchanan didn't run in 2000, there'd be a lot more solar panels today. But after 2000, Reform Party members wanted Buchanan to have an active role within the party, but Buchanan declined, I suppose because the Reform Party's full of losers. Though he did attend the 2001 party convention, and in a few years he identified himself as a political independent because he hated the neocons. But prior to 2004, he said that he wanted to become a Republican again, but he did not want to run for president again. And he endorsed George Bush in 2004, saying that he is right on taxes, judges, sovereignty, and values, and Kerry is right on nothing. Buchanan also endorsed Mitt Romney in 2012, stating that Obama offers more of the stalemate America that has gone through in the past 2 years, while Romney alone offers a possibility of hope and change, which is really ironic, but here you go. In 2016, Buchanan supported the nomination of Donald Trump, who ran on many of the same positions that Buchanan ran 20 years prior as the Republican presidential candidate in 1996. So notice this. Pat Buchanan ran against Donald Trump for the Reform Party nomination in 2000, or especially 1999. If you read a book, this is not in the Wikipedia article that I'm going over, but if you were to do some in-depth research like I have, you would notice that in 1999, you have the Reform Party, which had about $25 million in campaign financing. And if you know Donald Trump, he's a cheapskate, so even though he had billions of dollars in the 90s, he would prefer to go to the party that had the $25 million already there. So he got that leftover Perot money, supposedly. So it was between Pat Buchanan, Donald Trump, and Jesse Ventura. Now, Jesse Ventura is a weirdo. I don't know what he is politically. He's an independent, I believe. Then you have Pat Buchanan, who's far right, a paleoconservative, which a lot of people could describe Trump as now. But Trump then, back at the age of 53, I believe, was a neoliberal. Now, while Donald Trump was a businessman, he understood the effects of trade, and he was pro-fair trade, I believe. He said that we were getting ripped off by Japan at the time, which was more important than China, remember? But he did criticize Pat Buchanan. If you read interviews of Trump at the time, he called Pat Buchanan a Hitler lover, an anti-Semite, and that he denied the Holocaust. So a lot of these things that people accuse Trump of, he accused Pat Buchanan of, but he went full circle over a decade later. Very interesting, isn't it, no? So Pat Buchanan after 2016 is pretty much completely irrelevant. He has made some great books, and that's about it. So he's basically dead now. He's 81. He makes these videos. He looks terrible now. No offense, but he's gone out of relevancy, out of orthodoxy. Okay, now let's discuss the bigger things. Let's look at other people that are rising up in the paleoconservative movement. You have people like Tucker Carlson, a middle-aged guy from California, country club white boy, came out of privilege, but all of a sudden he feigns interest in the American people, and I believe him. To be completely honest, he did work for Crossfire, a Pat Buchanan type of thing. CNN he worked for 5 years, MSNBC from 2005 to 2008, and then Fox News for the last 10 years. He is one of the most popular people on TV in terms of Fox News. I think he's number 1 or 2 after Sean Hannity, who is a neocon sellout, who bandwagons after whoever the Republican president is at the time. He was George Bush stan, and then he was a Trump stan. That doesn't make logical sense, but it makes sense if you're going to ride on the coattails of the president. So let's get into Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is very interesting, as in you would see him as a libertarian type of person. He was a Ron Paul supporter in 2007 and 8. He was a George Bush supporter overall, but then all of a sudden when Trump became president, he slowly got more conservative. He didn't want people to overspend money on Israel. I don't think he's very open about it, but he is very tight-lipped. And he still thinks things like Donald Trump, and he's still a paleoconservative, but I think he hides it, which goes to the greater point, guys. People like Tucker need to keep their mouth shut. The media hates him, but the only thing that he has going on is a populist appeal. People that support Tucker Carlson on the left support him for being anti-free trade, anti-vulture capitalism and crony capitalism, for example, and being more nationally, he's economically a nationalist. This is the great appeal that conservatives can have on the left, where people can still admire somebody that is not on their side, but is a populist nonetheless. That's exactly where his relevance is purportedly from. Very important to note, Tucker Carlson, people say Tucker 2024. Do I think he's going to run in 2024? No, that seems like a joke. But very interesting, right? That he is an upcoming conservative. Isn't that kind of crazy? Okay, so to cut off that part of Tucker Carlson, it is clear that I don't think he's going to run in 2024, and I think it's a meme candidacy, but very interesting how certain young people in both parties are looking towards a populist sort of person in politics that can appeal to said internet crowd. Now let's go over to the most relevant paleoconservative in this year, somewhat with young people, and that is Nick Fuentes. Nicholas Joseph Fuentes, who knew his middle name was Joseph. Anyway, he is a guy born in 1998, so he's young. He is 21 years old. He is from Chicago, Illinois. This influenced the political ideology, trust me. He is the podcast runner of America First. He strongly opposes immigration as a demographic threat. He also opposes homosexuality, and he describes transgender people and same-sex marriage as deviancy. Very interesting, right? So we're seeing a person who honestly isn't that to the right in terms of social conservatism. Nick Fuentes, as a guy, he is not against homosexuality, but he thinks it's a sin to act on it, which is weird. But the point is that people like him are reasonable. That's the argument that he makes, is that he is normal. If you were to look back 50 years ago, he would have been completely moderate. But the Overton window shifting, this is a common threat, not only the demographic threat, but the Overton window threat. A big problem is immigration in terms of their voting record, but the other thing is liberal white people. That's a big problem. But that's a domestic issue, okay? That's a thing that needs to be noted. Now, when we're talking about optics in this whole thing, Fuentes attended the August 2017 Unite the Right rally, and he spoke about the tidal wave of white identity afterwards, and he bragged about it until it was a bad thing. So, very interesting, right? He was more of a Wignat back then, more of a white nationalist, but he's then rescinded that. But he's already tainted. This is important too. As a young guy, he went to this Confederate statue thing protest like an idiot, And he went there to meet people, Richard Spencer. Oh, wow, that's so cool. People are so cool. But, the consequences come with association, and so people slandered him. Unjustifiably so, but still, come on. And then he had a monologue where he got a very big taint on his record, where he did a Holocaust denial joke, which should be completely fine, but at the same time, the problem with him is that he is tongue-in-cheek with his humor, and people who, I understand that he doesn't believe the things that he says half the time, but people look bad on it. So that's a huge problem. That's an optics thing for paleoconservatives. He criticized Turning Point USA, which yet again is another problem because they're in favor of mass legal immigration, merit-based immigration. They're pro-Israel. They're Zionists. They are more accepting of the homos and the transvestites, and they clearly are more center and more libertarian conservatives, like Ben Shapiro, for example. So Nick Fuentes, this is a key distinction between a more libertarian Republican and a conservative, paleoconservative Republican. So Ben Shapiro, as a Jew, says that he's against gay marriage, abortion, transvestites, all this stuff. But he does not want the government to enforce a lot of those beliefs. Whereas Nick Fuentes, Pat Buchanan, and others believe that the state, as a statist himself, as he says, should be against immorality. For example, the gay marriage, the gender reassignment surgery, all that, abortion. They shouldn't intervene. This is a key distinction between the libertarian side and the populistic right side. Understand? That's what is to be noted if you watch this video for any reason. Okay, so I am 36 minutes into the video, and I want to say thanks for watching so far, but let's talk about the future of the movement of paleoconservatism. This is a long-winded way of saying everything about this movement, but it is important to get nuanced, and it is also important to look at how people discriminate against paleoconservatives even though they're not that far right at all. But this goes under the concept of the Overton window, and it is clear to see the big question now that you guys may have: is Trump a paleoconservative? Because if you see people like Ben Shapiro, people like Charlie Kirk, they all love Trump apparently, they'll support him at least, but people like Nick Fuentes, Pat Buchanan, and people to the right of Trump also like him. So what is he? So key statement. Let's look at Donald Trump. What is his way of thinking? What is his ideology? I personally believe that he is economically a nationalist. He is socially ambivalent. I don't think he really cares, and that's what he is. Is he a paleoconservative? I'd say he's more paleo-libertarian, maybe. So he's somewhere between the paleoconservatives and the neoconservatives, but here's a big issue. I don't think he really likes Turning Point USA. I don't think he really admires that side of republicanism, but since they own so much of the power, he has to succumb to them. So while I don't think he's really devoutedly against homosexual marriage, what he is against is, for example, would be the mass immigration. I believe that if he could press a button, he would put an immigration moratorium right now. He kind of already did, but he did succumb to big business interest with temporary visas and worker programs. So he is more fundamentally immigration restrictionist than a lot of people give him credit for on the left. But at the same time, through people manipulating the situation, through the people in the administration and other big business interests, his cabinet, for example, he is diluted in his ideology, and that slows him down, which gains a weaker base on the right side to him. You understand? So that pisses off people like Nick Fuentes, like Pat Buchanan, that want to see a complete cease of immigration. So personally, I identify somewhat as a paleoconservative. I do have some problems with their ideology, but I do think that it has a lot of good things attached to it. Is Trump a paleocon? I think he's closer to it than any other president off the top of my head, more than Ronald Reagan was, more than George Bush was, of course. But Fiscally conservative, I don't really think so. At the same time, because he does not reduce the deficit. Very interesting to purport. So now that we're done talking about Donald Trump, let's talk about who he has around him. A big issue with a president that is, let's say, a paleoconservative for the sake of the argument is that he has people that are Zionist, people that are globalist. Jared Kushner, who's a Jew that's a globalist, that if anything would be working for Bill Clinton if he weren't related to Trump. That guy sabotages all sorts of things. Trump is pro-Israel, but his daughter's married to a Jew, so what do you expect him to do? That's a very interesting thing. So you go into the concept of dual nationalities. That's a good important thing that the paleoconservatives bring over. They bring over the subject of racially, based traditions, racially based allegiances. So, for example, the Jewish American feels a tie to Israel, whereas a white American doesn't feel a particular tie to Europe, unless they're like a paleoconservative white person. So, very interesting dynamics that they pull apart here. What is important to note, though, is that some paleoconservatives go as far as to say that they want a white supermajority of like 90%. Some people want to ban pornography. Other people want to do all sorts of things that are like very extremist, honestly. But it's important to understand, not all of them are like that. They're not a monolith. They're not really alt-right. They're not fascists. They're not Nazis either. Very important to understand, people. Okay, another important question is, are paleoconservatives racist? Short answer, yes. But keep in mind, what's the definition of racism? You pull that out on the internet. What is the definition of racism? And what you see when you type is that it is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's race is superior. Or it could be this belief that all members of a race possess characteristics or abilities specific to the race, especially so that it is to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. Now, I don't think, depending on the definition, I don't think racism is necessarily bad, but I look at it as the kill and murder type of dichotomy, whereas you can kill a mosquito and that's fine, but you can murder a kid and that's bad. But you could also kill a pedophile and that's not bad. So point is that it's probably bad, but not necessarily. So for example, if you were to say we shouldn't let Chinese people in because of the coronavirus, sure, it's racist, but in general it makes sense, right? Or if you were to say, if you are of a different race and you're immigrating to a European-dominated country, you are going to fundamentally change that country, and the national consensus is that changing the country is not good demographically speaking. So in that case, that would be a racist immigration policy, but that thing's okay. The important thing to consider is that people are going to see it as a bad way. Now, paleoconservatives, from what I've seen, are against bigotry, knowingly. Okay? So to say that all blacks are stupid, that'd be bigoted. But if you're going to say that blacks are, as an average, lower IQ and have lower academic possibilities because of the IQ, that's racist. But is it okay? Kinda. I mean, this is very gray water that people are wading through. But, this is an important thing, too, with the optics. So while Charlie Kirk says, I'm not racist, I'm not racist, I'm not racist. Look, if you are, you got to defend your ideology, not that, oh, I'm a racist, oh, if I'm not. It is to say, what are the merits of the plans, what are the merits of your ideas, and if that works, then it works, not on the basis that I'm going to slander you this, and that's it. This is another concept. People need to understand. Nobody wants to be called an extremist. Why? Because it's not really a good thing. Extremists don't really get power unless it's through violence. What people that are not paleoconservatives should get is that the paleoconservatives are not a violent organization, which, let's go to this other thing. The newest fad in conservatism are the groypers. The groypers are Zoomers, which are Generation Z. So groypers are young people, young men predominantly, that are associated with Nick Fuentes as their leader, who has a paleoconservative Catholic type of orthodoxy around this movement, a kind of cult of personality around him. And these groypers go around and they do what they need to do. They expand their base in the conservative movement by attaching themselves to places like TikTok, and they will go and convert people. This is an important new branch of paleoconservatism in 2020. Paleoconservatism is not, it is old conservatism, but it is not relegated to 80-year-old white guys from Virginia like Pat Buchanan. It is not Sam Francis. It is not really Donald Trump, honestly. It is the young people that are coming back with this old retrograde version of conservatism and trying to go against the establishment. It is a right-wing populist movement. Please understand this. People that are groypers need to be articulate when they explain. There are a lexicon of things that are known. A lot of things that are known that people don't know. This goes into the whole red pill thing. And while I may be ranting at this point, I just think personally that the groyper movement is really an epic thing. It is a thing that is encapsulating an angst of white disillusioned people and other colored people that are seeing the problems with demographic change and acknowledge it and want to change it. That is what paleoconservatism is today. It is the groypers. Tomorrow, will it be in 5 years? I don't know. I don't really probably not, but please understand this. Now, people criticize others for being to the right of them. Please understand. People on the Biden side don't hate the Bernie people like how the Charlie Kirks hate the Nick Fuenteses. Understand. People are extremely hasty to really get to grips with the Overton window. The Overton window says that democratic socialism to Ben Shapiro is about as far as you can be. Whereas people like Fuentes want to stretch it out to say from Fuentes to Sanders, that's the line. That is a good thing to know. Okay? That's another thing that you need to note. The Overton window will kill you or it will embrace you. Understand. The floor is lava and the lava is paleoconservatism at this point, but it is getting normalized. Understand that trend. This rant video I think was informative. Tell me if it was. Thank you for watching. Comment down below if you liked it. Thank you.